The police received a call from a trailer park in nearby Clyde. A resident had spotted an unfamiliar black Chevrolet parked in the lot, its windows fogged up and the driver nowhere to be seen. The car had been there for some time, unmoving. When officers arrived to investigate, they quickly determined that the car belonged to a woman. But what they found inside the car was shocking. Heather Bogle's lifeless body was found in the trunk of her own car. She was tightly squeezed into the space, positioned in a way that suggested great effort had been made to conceal her. The trunk was locked. The car itself was neatly parked, as if whoever had left it there had taken great care to avoid attracting attention. The condition of Heather's body immediately raised questions. Heather had been brutally beaten. Her skin showed signs of blunt force trauma. Her fingernails were cut unnaturally short. Her hair had been roughly cut, and her body had been wiped clean, as if someone had tried to wipe away evidence to clean up the scene. She had been shot twice, in a manner that suggested calculated violence rather than random rage. Dear viewers, in the next video releases, you will find very intriguing and confusing cases, and in order not to miss them, be sure to subscribe to the channel and please like the video. In the quiet corners of Northwest Ohio, nestled between small towns and long stretches of farmland, the rhythms of daily life move at a steady, almost soothing pace. It's a place where everyone seems to know everyone else. Neighbors wave from their porches. The local diner always remembers your order, and stories travel fast, especially those that begin with tragedy. But before Heather Bogle's name became synonymous with one of the most disturbing investigations in recent Ohio history, she was simply known as a devoted mother, a hard-working woman trying to build a better future for herself and her young daughter. Heather Bogle was born and raised in Sandusky County, Ohio, a region where opportunities are limited and the working class forms the backbone of society. From a young age, Heather was known for her bright smile, quiet resilience, and strong sense of loyalty to the people she cared about. She was not one to seek attention or drama. She kept her circle of loved ones close and focused most of her energy on her family, especially her daughter Mackenzie. Being a single mother had its share of challenges, but Heather embraced the role with an unwavering sense of purpose. Her daughter was the center of her world. Every decision she made, every job she took, every late night and early morning she spent, it was all done with Mackenzie in mind. Heather's friends often described her as someone who never gave up, even when the odds were stacked against her. Whether she was juggling shifts or dealing with personal issues, she did it all with a quiet determination. Towards the end of her 30s, Heather began to dream of something more for herself and her daughters. She recently went back to school to earn a degree in nursing, a field that aligned with her sense of caring and responsibility. She wanted stability not only financially, but emotionally as well. After years of relationship turmoil and struggling to make ends meet, nursing offered a tangible way forward, a chance to give Mackenzie a life she'd never had. To support that dream, Heather worked nights at the Whirlpool plant in nearby Clyde, a large business and one of the region's largest employers. The job wasn't glamorous, it was hard, physical labor in a factory setting, but it paid the bills, and more importantly, it offered a schedule that allowed Heather to attend classes during the day. Her life became a carefully balanced routine, working nights, caring for Mackenzie, going to school, studying when she could, sleeping in between. Despite the daily pressures, Heather never lost her sense of humor or her ability to connect with people. She was quiet, but had deep empathy for those around her. Friends and colleagues often described her as quiet but thoughtful, with a sharp mind when she opened up. She had no time for drama, and she wasn't in the business of being popular. Heather was down to earth, focused on the essentials: her daughter, her education, her future. But Heather had layers that weren't immediately apparent. Like many people trying to rebuild their lives, she had experienced pain, relationships that didn't work out, emotional setbacks, moments of uncertainty about the future. Some who knew her closely said she had recently gotten out of a difficult romantic relationship. Although Heather didn't often talk about her personal life, those around her sensed that she was trying to distance herself from people who brought instability or conflict into her world. Social media offered a window into Heather's mind. Her Facebook page, like many new mothers, was filled with photos of her daughter, encouraging quotes, and the occasional post that hinted at the struggle beneath the surface. Messages about starting over, about not looking back, about fighting for the life she wanted. To an outsider, these posts might have seemed like typical ruminations, but to those who knew her best, they revealed a woman trying, really trying, to take control of her story. Heather was nearing the end of her coursework, on track to graduate soon with a nursing degree. Her long nights at the factory were ending, and the promise of a new chapter was tangible. She talked about new goals, about possibly moving, about spending more time being a mother and less time trying to make ends meet. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was possibility. The people in Heather's life noticed the change. Her sister, friends, and colleagues noted that she had been energized in recent weeks. She seemed more focused, more determined. There was talk of job interviews, maybe even a move to a better place. She had invested in herself, and it was paying off. Heather Bogle was simply a woman doing her best to create a better life. She had hopes, fears, dreams, and, above all, a love for her daughter that shaped everything she did. She wasn't a statistic. She wasn't an enigma. She was a mother, a student, a fighter. Then, on the morning of April 9th, 2015, she didn't return home. As the hours turned to days, the questions began to multiply. Where had she gone? Who had she seen? Why had no one heard from her? For her family, especially her daughter, the silence was unbearable. And in a world where stories like hers often boil down to their final moments, it's important to remember who Heather Bogle was, before everything changed. April 9th, 2015 began like any other day for Heather Bogle, but within 24 hours, the small, tight-knit communities of Sandusky County were shaken to their core. In towns where everyone knows everyone else by name, sudden violence isn't just rare, it's unthinkable. That's part of what made Heather's disappearance so deeply troubling. It didn't fit. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She had places to go, a daughter waiting for her, and a future she was fighting hard for. That morning, Heather had finished her night shift at the Whirlpool plant in Clyde, Ohio. It was just after 6 a.m. when she left work, stepped out into the dim spring light, and headed toward the parking lot. Her co-workers remembered nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of distress, no confrontation. Surveillance video confirmed that she had walked to her car alone. From that moment on, Heather Bogle seemed to have disappeared without a trace. When Heather failed to return home that morning, her family quickly grew concerned. Keeping quiet was not her style, especially when her daughter depended on her for her daily routine. She hadn't shown up to pick up Mackenzie, hadn't responded to texts or calls, and her phone had gone dead. Over time, concern turned to fear. By the evening of April 9th, Heather had been officially declared missing. Police began canvassing locations where Heather might have appeared, but none yielded results. Her family printed out flyers with her photo and posted them around the city, hoping that someone had seen her. Colleagues recalled her behavior over the past few days, trying to find at least some hint that she could have been planning to disappear. But there were no such signs. Everything pointed to the fact that Heather intended to return home, as always. Her car also did not appear in any of her usual places. CCTV cameras on the surrounding streets did not record her car in motion. It felt as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. Posts with requests for help began to appear on social networks. And although at first it looked like a tragic, but perhaps explainable situation, soon everything took on a much more alarming tone. With each passing hour, the tension grew. Relatives began calling friends, colleagues, former partners, anyone who could know anything. The police department formed a special group to work on the missing person case. But despite their efforts, there was no trace of Heather in any hospital, hotel, or emergency room. Investigators had no motive or suspects. Even her mobile phone gave no hope. The signal disappeared almost immediately after she left the plant. Mackenzie began to have sleepless nights. She did not understand why her mother did not come home. The family tried to remain hopeful, but inside everyone already felt that something terrible had happened. People who had not previously met Heather began to worry about her fate, sharing posts and joining the search. And then, just 24 hours after she disappeared, a call came in that changed the course of the investigation. The next day, April 10th, 2015, the police received a call from a trailer park in nearby Clyde. One of the residents noticed an unfamiliar black Chevrolet parked in the parking lot. Its windows were fogged up. The driver was nowhere to be seen. The car stood there for some time, not moving. When police arrived to investigate, they quickly determined that the car belonged to Heather Bogle. But what they found inside shattered the community's sense of safety. Heather's lifeless body was discovered in the trunk of her own car. She was tightly packed into the space, positioned in a way that suggested great effort had been made to conceal her. The trunk was locked. The car itself was neatly parked, as if whoever left it there had taken great care to avoid attracting attention. The condition of Heather's body immediately raised questions. While this is a story we will treat with caution, it is important to understand the gravity of what investigators found. Heather had been brutally beaten. Her skin showed signs of blunt force trauma. Her fingernails were cut unnaturally short. Her hair had been roughly cut, and her body had been scrubbed, as if someone had tried to wipe away evidence to clean up the scene. She had been shot twice, in a manner that suggested calculated violence rather than random rage. The way she had been treated told investigators this was not an impulsive act. It was methodical, controlled, personal. The location of the car only deepened the mystery. The trailer park was tucked away off the main roads, not far from where Heather worked. It was not where she usually went. People living nearby did not recognize the car or hear or see anything out of the ordinary. No sounds, no sign of a struggle. Just a parked car, sitting quietly in the early spring fog. As word of the discovery spread, the community's fear turned to grief and confusion. How could something so cruel, so deliberate, happen to someone like Heather? Who could have done it, and why? Law enforcement now had a murder case, and they knew from the start that the pressure would be enormous. Heather wasn't a stranger. She was someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone who worked alongside friends and neighbors. The public wanted answers, and they wanted them fast. Forensic scientists searched the car. They took samples from the trunk, tested for DNA, checked fingerprints, and tested fibers. The body was sent for an autopsy. It took time to get the full results, but the early signs pointed to one thing. Whoever did this knew how to leave no obvious clues. There were no immediate suspects. Heather's phone was missing. Her purse was gone. But there was no sign of theft as a motive. Her car hadn't been ransacked. Her bank accounts hadn't been touched. There was no evidence that she'd been stolen. Instead, investigators began looking more closely at her personal life, the people she knew, the people she could trust. Heather had recently been in a romantic relationship, one that friends described as on and off and possibly volatile. Some speculated there had been arguments, tensions, questions of jealousy. Law enforcement took note and began questioning people in her inner circle. One by one, friends, co-workers, and family members were called in for questioning. The case grew. Every possibility was considered. Was this a crime of passion? Was it someone from her past? An ex? A co-worker? A stranger? Someone she met online? But it wasn't that simple. Whoever committed this crime had taken steps to hide their identity. The physical evidence had been erased, or at least attempted to be. The location of her car appeared to be deliberate. Heather's phone was never found, meaning there were no GPS signals, recent text messages, or calls that could have guided the investigation. And there was something else that gave detectives pause. The calculated nature of the crime didn't match any recent incidents in the area. There were no similar homicides, no open cases that reflected this level of methodical violence. This wasn't someone acting on impulse. It seemed like someone had done this, or something like it, before. An autopsy confirmed the horrific cause of death. Heather died from 2 gunshot wounds to the torso. The coroner's report also noted other injuries, bruises, abrasions, and marks from being restrained. But the exact timing of those injuries remained unclear. What was clear, however, was that she hadn't died quickly or peacefully. Her final moments were filled with fear and pain, though the exact sequence remained shrouded in mystery. Back at the scene, The trailer park had become a makeshift hub of police activity. Officers scoured the area, hoping to find a lead, a witness, a camera, anything. But in an area where few people had CCTV and even fewer were awake in the early morning, there was little information. The car had no damage, no signs of forced entry. Investigators believed Heather had gotten into the car voluntarily, or had never gotten out of it. That pointed to a suspect she likely knew, the face she recognized, someone who had access to her, who could approach her without causing alarm. But as the days passed and the investigation hit a dead end, the community's shock turned to disappointment. Online, amateur sleuths began to speculate. People began to whisper names. Rumors began to spread, some true, some fear. The sheriff's office offered a reward for information. Local news stations covered the story every night. Heather's family begged for help. Her sister, devastated, stood before cameras, begging the public for answers. "She didn't deserve this," she said, her voice shaking. "We just want justice. We want to know who did this to her." But behind the scenes, investigators were under increasing pressure, and cracks were beginning to show. In their rush to bring someone to justice, law enforcement soon began focusing on suspects who, in retrospect, never matched the facts. And while the public thought the case was on the verge of being solved, the truth was far more complicated. The real killer was still at large. And the investigation was about to take a turn that would raise serious questions. Questions not just about who killed Heather Bogle, but about how the system itself had almost let them get away with it. The lead investigator was Detective Sean O'Connell, a seasoned officer with a reputation for tenacity and strong instincts. From the outside, he seemed like the right man for the job. But as the weeks passed, what began as a hopeful quest for the truth slowly turned into a cautionary tale. One of tunnel vision, poor judgment, and the dangers of when pressure outweighs process. From the start, Detective O'Connell believed the key to solving the case lay in Heather's personal relationships. And that wasn't necessarily a bad lead. Statistically, most murders involve someone the victim knew. But what followed was a series of mistakes that not only derailed the investigation for years, but also nearly allowed the real killer to slip away entirely. O'Connell zeroed in on 3 people in Heather's circle, all women. One was a recent romantic partner of Heather's, a woman she'd been dating for months before her death. The relationship had reportedly ended on unspecified terms. Another was a woman Heather had reportedly exchanged messages with in the past. The third was a friend. O'Connell became convinced that these women, individually or together, were involved in Heather's death. But there was no physical evidence to support this theory. No DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitness statements, no digital trail linking them to the crime. Still, O'Connell doggedly pursued the lead. He claimed jealousy, betrayal, emotional instability, and he leaned heavily on motive, leaving the question of means and opportunity unclear. The families of the women involved soon grew concerned. They claimed their daughters were being targeted unfairly and without cause. At one point, law enforcement publicly named one of the women as a suspect, a move that drew sharp criticism, especially when it became clear that the evidence against her was circumstantial at best. What O'Connell didn't reveal, at least to the public, was that forensic testing had already begun to tell a different story. The DNA evidence found on Heather's body didn't match any of the women under investigation. In fact, it didn't match any known law enforcement database at the time. Rather than widen the scope of the investigation, however, O'Connell redoubled his efforts. He continued to pursue the women he identified, reportedly ignoring or downplaying forensic inconsistencies. Theory, it seemed, became more important than fact. Eventually, the internal tensions within the department became too great to ignore. Questions arose, not just from the public, but from within the justice system. Prosecutors, unable to move forward without clear evidence, grew increasingly concerned about the direction of the case. And Heather's family, though desperate for justice, grew concerned about the lack of progress and the seemingly one-sided investigation. Then came the tipping point. In 2017, an internal review was launched into Detective Sean O'Connell's conduct. What investigators found was deeply troubling. It appeared that O'Connell had withheld evidence, including DNA results, that pointed away from his prime suspects. He falsified witness statements, omitted key facts from his reports, and failed to follow up on credible leads that didn't fit his theory. The very process that was meant to uncover the truth was compromised by one misguided intent to bend evidence to fit a narrative, regardless of whether it was correct. O'Connell was removed from the case. Shortly thereafter, he was charged with tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice. In 2018, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to prison, a rare and sobering moment in which a law enforcement officer was held accountable for actively undermining a murder investigation. For the people of Sandusky County, the discovery was stunning. Not only had a young mother been murdered, but the man assigned to solve the crime had been leading the case astray for 2 critical years. And all the while, the real killer remained at large. After O'Connell was fired and the case fell apart, a new team of investigators took over. They began by going back to the beginning, reviewing the evidence, the autopsy report, digital traces, witness interviews, and, most importantly, forensic evidence. That's when something remarkable happened. As the new detectives combed through DNA evidence, they identified a male DNA profile on Heather's body, one that had remained unmatched for years. But now, with access to larger databases and more advanced testing, a potential lead emerged. The DNA matched a man named Daniel Myers, a quiet, unassuming co-worker of Heather's at the Whirlpool plant. He was someone who had completely disappeared from view during the initial investigation. There was no reason to suspect him. No obvious connections outside of the workplace. No previous convictions that linked him to violent behavior. He had never been questioned, never called, never even mentioned, and yet his DNA was now indisputably linked to Heather's body. Detectives zeroed in on Myers, digging into his past. What they found was almost immediately alarming. Daniel Myers had a history that hadn't been thoroughly investigated. Allegations of domestic violence, controlling behavior, and a dark streak that had largely gone unnoticed. He had once been questioned years earlier in connection with a suspicious death, though charges were never filed. Those who knew him described him as manipulative, a man who could remain calm while hiding something much darker beneath. The theory that Heather had been killed by someone she trusted, someone she worked with, shattered previous assumptions. This was not a love triangle. This was not a spontaneous act of jealousy. This was something far more sinister. A calculated, premeditated murder committed by someone hiding in plain sight. 2 years of false leads, wasted time, and missed opportunities. But now, there was momentum. There was clarity. And there was hope that justice might finally be within reach. As the trial began to move toward trial, prosecutors prepared to tell their case. The truth, long buried beneath false assumptions, was finally beginning to emerge. By the time Daniel Myers was arrested and charged with Heather Bogle's murder in early 2017, the story had already taken on disturbing resonance in Sandusky County. What began as a horrific crime soon became a lesson in how justice can be delayed. Not for lack of evidence, but for the dangerous consequences of pursuing the wrong suspect. Now, after 2 years of misdirection, a new team of investigators had assembled what they believed to be a smoking gun against the man they were certain took Heather's life. But before the trial could begin, the justice system had to untangle the damage done during the original investigation. Detective Sean O'Connell's misconduct had called nearly every element of the case into question. Evidence had to be re-examined, old interviews revisited, and legal strategies adapted. Prosecutors had to ensure that the court not only convicted the right man, but that he would withstand legal scrutiny. The integrity of the case was now as important as its outcome. Daniel Myers, now charged with capital murder and several related charges, has pleaded not guilty. His defense argued that the presence of his DNA did not necessarily mean he committed the murder. They suggested that contact could have occurred earlier, or through secondary transmission. But for prosecutors, that argument was irrelevant. Heather had no known personal relationship with Myers. There was no evidence that they had ever communicated, texted, or met outside of the workplace. Myers had never been seen with Heather in a context that would explain the intimate nature of the DNA found on her body. For the state, the case was chillingly simple. Daniel Myers, a man with a dark past and a habit of control and manipulation, targeted Heather Bogle. He waited until she was vulnerable, just after a night shift, likely tired, unsuspecting, and alone. Investigators believed he lured her to a secluded area, tied her up, and carried out a brutal, premeditated attack. He then tried to erase all the evidence, cutting her nails, cutting her hair, wiping her body, all to avoid detection. The trial officially began in 2019, 4 years after Heather's death. Emotions ran high in the courtroom. Heather's family, many of whom wore purple, the color associated with domestic violence awareness, filled the gallery each day. Her sister, Heather Bogle, had become a vocal advocate for justice, speaking at press conferences, giving interviews, and not letting her sister's memory fade. Now she watched as the man accused of taking Heather's life sat calmly before a judge and jury. The prosecution presented a methodical, evidence-based case. At the center of their argument was DNA. Specifically, a male DNA profile found on Heather's body that matched Daniel Myers. But DNA wasn't the only evidence. They presented forensic evidence from the crime scene, phone records, and statements from people who knew Myers personally, particularly women who described his abusive, controlling, and erratic behavior in the past. One ex-girlfriend testified that Myers had choked her during heated arguments. Another recalled how he isolated her from friends and family, exerting psychological control and threatening her when she tried to leave. These accounts weren't just shocking. They helped build a behavioral pattern that matched the psychological profile of someone capable of committing such a brutal and calculated murder. The prosecution also emphasized the planning that went into Heather's murder. It was not an impulsive act. From the manner of the killing to the careful staging of her body, everything pointed to premeditation. The hair cutting, the nail trimming, the skin cleaning, all of it was done to hamper forensic identification. But despite this, Myers left out one crucial detail. He left behind DNA. When it was the defense's turn, they tried to cast doubt on the timeline and the chain of evidence. They argued that the investigation was tainted by earlier misconduct. Sean O'Connell's frame-up, they argued, should make jurors question whether anything could be trusted. If the original detective had manipulated the case before, how could jurors be sure that the current charges weren't the result of the same systemic problems? But prosecutors fought back. The evidence that led to Myers only emerged after O'Connell's dismissal. In fact, it was O'Connell's refusal to consider that very DNA that allowed Myers to avoid scrutiny in the first place. Far from being part of a compromised case, the evidence against Myers was a blank slate that investigators discovered after correcting the original errors. It was a new investigation, with new oversight, new methods, and a renewed emphasis on evidence over speculation. The jury listened intently as both sides laid out their cases. For many, the most chilling moments came when they saw the physical evidence. Images of Heather's car, the trunk where her body was found, and the autopsy reports detailing the brutality of the crime. They were shown sparingly and carefully, but they made one thing devastatingly clear. Whoever did this had gone to great lengths to destroy not just evidence, but dignity. As the trial progressed, a clearer picture of Daniel Myers emerged. He was not just a quiet colleague with no criminal record. He was someone who had quietly terrorized the women in his personal life for years, leaving no public trace but a wealth of private scars. One of the prosecution's most powerful witnesses described a moment when she felt Myers was practicing his violence against her, testing the waters, gauging how much control he could wield. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the tension was palpable. The courtroom sat in near silence, bracing itself for a verdict that had taken 4 years to reach. Hours passed, then a day, and then, on the second day of deliberations, the jury returned. Daniel Myers was found guilty on all charges, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. As the verdict was read, Heather's family wept quietly. Some held hands, others simply bowed their heads. For them, this was not a moment of celebration. It was a long overdue closure to a journey that began with unimaginable grief, passed through the betrayal of a system, and ended with accountability. Justice, though delayed, had finally been served. At sentencing, the prosecution asked for the maximum, life in prison without the possibility of parole. They cited the premeditated nature of the crime, the attempts to destroy evidence, and Myers' ongoing pattern of violence. The judge agreed. Daniel Myers was sentenced to life without parole, ensuring he would never be free again. In his final moments in court, Myers offered no apologies, no explanation. He simply stared ahead, impassively, as the courtroom began to empty.